The police side of the Institute was the really important side. It existed to relieve the ordinary executive of what might be called all sanitary cases, a category which ranged from vaccination to charges of unnatural vice, from which it was only a step to bringing in all cases of blackmail. As regards crime in general, they had already populated in the press the idea that the Institute should be allowed to experiment pretty largely, in the hope of discovering how far humane remedial treatment could be substituted for the old notion of retributive or vindictive punishment. There was a lot of legal red tape that stood in their way. But there are only two papers we don't control, said the fairy, and we'll smash them. The sheer goodness of my heart, we are extending the sale throughout the entire merchandise store at Young Heretics. If you go to youngheretics.com/shop, you'll find a bunch of awesome gear. We've got t-shirts. There's the We're Reading Homer and Screw You shirt, which I personally love to wear around and about. But there's Young Heretics hats, there's stickers, all really high quality stuff. And it's 20% off. We've extended this sale past Christmas until January 15th. So it's a New Year's sale. You use code CHEERS at checkout. You get 20% off absolutely everything. These things make great gifts, or you can hoard them for yourself. But go and check it out, youngheretics.com/shop. Everything is 20% off until January 15th, and then we really are cutting it off. So go get it now. Use CHEERS at checkout for the discount. You will be surprised to learn that that was not a Davos press release. This mastermind plan to control the newspapers and begin by vaccinating the public and end by taking over the entire world. That was not the Build Back Better list of agenda items, but rather a passage from That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, the third novel in the Space Trilogy, or the Ransom Trilogy, which we've been discussing now for 3 episodes. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Out of the Silent Planet. Last week, we talked about Paralandra. Now we're talking about the culmination, the capstone of the trilogy, which takes place on Earth. It's called That Hideous Strength. It stands almost entirely alone. Ransom, who's been our hero throughout space and time, comes back to Earth and does play a crucial role in this novel, but is not the main protagonist. It focuses on the kind of spiritual journey and world-ending struggle of Mark and Jane Studdock, this sort of ordinary married couple. And it can, as Lewis says in the introduction, be read alone. I think this is the best novel that Lewis ever wrote. And I'll tell you why. It's not because there aren't great things in his other novels, and obviously Narnia is the iconic thing that he wrote, but this is a novel which takes place on Earth among human people. And Lewis uses all of his enormous insight into the human heart, into the just ways that, the subtle ways that people deceive themselves and convince themselves and fall down traps. Some of the stuff we talked about with Solzhenitsyn and acquiescence to totalitarian regimes. Lewis knew and understood that as well, having lived through both world wars. And he writes with pristine clarity about the psychology of individual people. And then he brings his enormous space mythology, all of this kind of celestial imagery that we've been describing over these past 2 episodes. He brings that all down to bear on Earth. He starts with human drama, and then he shows how these celestial forces are actually deeply invested in, and in some senses, outgrowths of what's going on between real people on Earth. That makes it more human. It makes it at higher stakes than any of his other novels, and it makes it more relatable because we can understand how we ourselves might be in the position of making exactly the choices these characters are making, and we see through Lewis how on those choices the fate of the universe might hang. It's a masterwork, and I'm going to say something maybe even a little bit blasphemous when I suggest that if you are not super into science fiction and you've maybe had trouble getting into this trilogy in the past, or it doesn't sound super exciting to you, start with the 3rd book. This is, I know, for purists, and even for me, it tears my heart open a little bit to suggest that you should start with the 3rd book. But the 3rd book is so good that you'll get engrossed in the world that way, and then you'll enjoy reading the first 2. They really do stand alone, and if you want to go in order, of course you can. Many people do. Most people probably read the trilogy that way, but for my money, start with the 3rd book. It is its own creation. It's magnificently relevant to everything that's currently going on because it is about post-humanism and the use of technology and science to dominate and erase the human spirit, which is exactly, I think, what our ruling classes believe in right now. I've read to you already some excerpts from post-humanist treatises, this idea that we're all going to be uploaded into the metaverse, that we're going to become little avatars of ourselves. My friend and colleague James Poulos is fond of pointing out that in Facebook's new sort of Farmville-style game, you become basically a floating torso with no legs. And this is a literalization of what Lewis was talking about in this book and in The Abolition of Man, of men without chests, right? That the only good thing about human beings, or the divine thing about them, is that they have minds, that they're capable of reason. And so the fact that they're also animals, that they have bodies, they have flesh, all of that needs to be done away with. It's disgusting and it's filthy. And for the sake of sanitation and efficiency, what we need to do is upload ourselves into the cloud and become disembodied consciousnesses. As I said last week, the beginnings of that project are not working out very well. They're making us less happy, more infertile, more sick, more ugly, more depressed. But the premise is that if we just go all the way down this line that is currently making us miserable, well, then we'll be happy. This is a beautiful dramatization of that, and it's a wonderful, subtle, slow, terrifying dramatization of how Satan slowly reveals himself in logic that initially looks appealing and futuristic and progressive. Really a beautiful novel in so many different ways. As always, I'm going to try not to spoil the whole plot of it, but I'm going instead to introduce you to some of the themes that Lewis takes from his nonfiction reflections, from his philosophical writing, from his theological writing, and show you how he takes those ideas which he states and shows them to you in drama in this novel. And then I really do think you should go away and read this one because there's no better novel to be reading at this time. Let's talk about your soul. Not your spiritual soul, not the thing that makes you alive, but the S-O-L-E, the sole of your foot. Almost as important. Not quite as important as your spiritual soul, but very important. I, as you know, I'm a weightlifter, and this is especially important on things like deadlifts for me, but really just anything active that you do, walking, running, right? Anything that involves like a lot of pressure on your feet. You need these sole footbeds. They are made of this kind of recycled cork material. It's incredibly springy and comfortable, and they slip into your shoes, and they really do make a big difference. They've made a difference for my stance when I'm doing deadlifts, like I said, but also just walking around the house. They have these great sandals that I really love. So they've got a ton of different products, and you can pick and choose the ones that you like depending on, you know, what your active lifestyle is like, whether you're a runner, whether you golf, whatever. But really anybody can benefit from this. They feel fantastic. I've tried forever to get good flip-flops, and Soul finally got them for me. I really love these. So what you do is you go to yoursoul.com/heretics, and you'll get an incredible discount. It's 50% off if you're a first-time customer. So yoursoul.com/heretics and get your 50% discount on anything in the store. Their footbeds, their sandals, anything at all that you want that can help you to just live your life in a more comfortable way. Highly, highly recommend them. yoursoul.com/heretics for 50% off the entire store as a first-time customer. Check it out. So the premise of this novel, just the kind of bare bones of the plot, is that there is Lewis invents a third university, the University of Edgestowe, I think it's meant to be pronounced. And like Oxford and Cambridge, this university is divided into colleges. For those that don't know, Oxford and Cambridge have these sort of autonomous colleges. So you don't actually go specifically just to Oxford University in general. You go to Magdalen College, as Lewis did, or you go to Trinity College in Cambridge, or whatever. And this is especially true if you're an undergraduate, that you actually apply specifically to this college. And so they kind of create this hermetically sealed little world. And of course, it's linked to the rest of the university, but the colleges have their own culture. They have their own amenities. People eat together in the dining hall. All of this stuff becomes kind of its own little hermetically sealed universe. And so Lewis invents this as the sort of jumping off point for for the whole cosmic drama, because it's kind of a world in miniature, a little society in miniature. And the college is called Bracton College, and one of the fellows there is called Mark Studdock, and he and his wife are sort of young up-and-comers. Mark is an up-and-comer, and Jane is working on finishing her PhD, but she's also at home and feeling sort of dissatisfied. She's one of these women who probably would like to be a homemaker, but she's been made dissatisfied by a whole bunch of sort of modern rhetoric about how women should, get out there and accomplish things. And Lewis says rather gently, she was probably not the most original of thinkers, but she had this PhD thesis on John Donne that she was trying to write. So Jane's at home, and Mark is making his way in the world. Mark is sort of, in a position to become really somebody in this academic milieu. He's a sociologist. He studies sociology, and he is becoming wrapped up in what Lewis throughout his career called the inner ring. So I'm going to read to you first a couple of dialogues between Mark and the guy that is just directly above him, the under warden, the deputy warden of the college. And Mark is kind of getting on friendly terms with this guy named Curry, who is the sub-warden of Bracton. So it's all kind of internecine administrative politics. But to be in this group, the kind of secret group of people who are really in control of what goes on in college, is very appealing to Mark. He has this kind of longing to be on the inside. And so here's the first meeting in the novel between him and Curry. Mark Studdock was himself a sociologist and had been elected to a fellowship in that subject 5 years ago. He was beginning to find his feet. If he had felt any doubt on that point, which he did not, it would have been laid to rest when he found himself meeting Curry just outside the post office, and seeing how natural Curry found it that they should walk to college together and discuss the agenda for their meeting. Curry was the sub-warden of Bracton. Yes, said Curry, it will take the hell of a time. Probably go on after dinner. We'll have all the obstructionists wasting time as hard as they can, but luckily, that's the worst they can do. You would never have guessed from the tone of Studdock's reply what intense pleasure he derived from Curry's use of the pronoun we. So very recently he had been an outsider, watching the proceedings with what he then called Curry and his gang, with awe and with little understanding, and making at college meetings short, nervous speeches which never influenced the course of events. Now he was inside, and Curry and his gang had become we, or the progressive element in college. It had all happened quite suddenly, and was still sweet in the mouth. You think it'll go through then? Said Studdock. Sure to, said Curry. We've got the warden and the bursar and all the chemical and biochemical people for a start. I've tackled Pelham and Ted, and they're sound. I've made Sancho believe that he sees the point and that he's in favor of it. Bill the Blizzard will probably do something pretty devastating, but he's bound to side with us if it comes to a vote. Besides, I haven't yet told you, Dick's going to be there. He came up in time for dinner last night and got busy at once. Studdock's mind darted hither and thither in search of some safe way to conceal the fact that he did not know who Dick was. In the nick of time, he remembered a very obscure colleague whose Christian name was Richard. Telford? Said Studdock in a puzzled voice. He knew very well that Telford could not be the Dick that Curry meant, and therefore threw a slightly whimsical and ironical tone into his question. Good Lord, Telford, said Curry with a laugh. No, I mean Lord Feverstone, Dick Devine, as he used to be. I was a little baffled by the idea of Telford, said Studdock, joining in the laugh. I'm glad Feverstone is coming. I've never met him, you know. Dick Devine, as he used to be. Those who have been following with this series will know that Dick Devine is the accomplice of Weston, the sort of mad scientist that traveled to Pearlander and became the object of demonic possession. So this is how this book works: is the little threads from the previous two stories kind of pick up and will be recognizable as Easter eggs in this story. But if you didn't know who Dick Devine was, it would not be a problem. So here's Dick Devine, now Lord Feverstone. He's made his way in the world. He's becoming somebody that, everybody gasps when he enters the room. And the psychology of this interaction is incredibly subtle, that we've all been, I think, in some sort of situation where you have this impulse to pretend you know things you don't know, to pretend that, of course, everybody, does X or Y or knows this sort of thing. And this is what Lewis calls the allure of the inner ring. And he's elsewhere, he compares it to this scene in in Tolstoy's War and Peace, where suddenly we realize that within the army, there's not only the normal hierarchy, that is people who are in charge of other people, but there's also this subtle hierarchy of like some people can get things done and know things. And network, we would call this networking today, right? We would call it a kind of hyper-competitive and very underhand sort of networking, which happens in every human society. So it happens here in this little microcosm society where there are official leaders. There's a warden and a subwarden. But you'll notice already that the subwarden is really the guy you talk to if you want to get things done. And Mark is enamored, almost in a sort of flirtatious or romantic way. He's being sort of gradually allowed into this inner circle, and he would do anything for it. I mean, we've all felt this way, right? The cool kids at school, or the group at your office that kind of all goes out after work, or, the people who, the secret group chat that happens in the background, right? We all want in. And this reflects in Lewis's view, the very real desire that we have to be allowed into the society of God, that we have this kind of yearning for belonging and family. And that yearning gets twisted and contorted in all sorts of ways until it becomes a means for people to wield power over other people. Because there are many inner rings, not all, but many inner rings whose whole existence is just about being the inner ring. It's not because they're doing anything particularly good. And as it turns out, this inner ring is putting forward a proposal that will effectively destroy the culture of the college. We're going to get into a little bit of that in a bit. But the fact of their being on the in makes people want to join them and do things they would otherwise never do. So now I'll read to you a portion of a speech that Lewis gave at King's College at the University of London. And this was 1944. He gave this speech. So right about the same time as this novel. This obviously is a series of ideas that are in his head at the time. And he's preaching with really still excellent advice, still worth reading this speech, because he's preaching against the world. He says, I'm here to talk to you about the world, the flesh, and the devil, the three Christian antagonists, the things that Christians need to watch out for. And you already know about the flesh because you're red-blooded young men. And I don't want to be associated with the devil, so I'm going to tell you about the world. Here's his kind of keystone paragraph in this speech. He says, "It would be polite and charitable, and in view of your age, reasonable too, to suppose that none of you is yet a scoundrel. On the other hand, by the mere law of averages, I am saying nothing against free will, it is almost certain that at least 2 or 3 of you before you die will have become something very like scoundrels. There must be in this room the makings of at least that number of unscrupulous, treacherous, ruthless egotists. The choice is still before you, and I hope you will not take my hard words about your possible future characters as a token of disrespect to your present characters. And the prophecy I make is this. To 9 out of 10 of you, the choice which could lead to scoundrelism will come, when it does come, in no very dramatic colors. Obviously bad men, obviously threatening or bribing, will almost certainly not appear. Over a drink or a cup of coffee, disguised as a triviality and sandwiched between 2 jokes from the lips of a man or woman whom you have recently been getting to know rather better, and whom you hope to know better still, just at the moment when you are most anxious not to appear crude or naif or a prig, the hint will come. It will be the hint of something which is not quite in accordance with the technical rules of fair play, something which the public, the ignorant, romantic public, would never understand, something which even the outsiders in your own profession are apt to make a fuss about, but something, says your new friend, which we, and at the word we you try not to blush for mere pleasure, something we always do, and you will be drawn in, if you are drawn in, not by desire for gain or ease, but simply because at that moment, when the cup was so near your lips, you cannot bear to be thrust back again into the cold outer world. It would be so terrible to see the other man's face, that genial, confidential, delightfully sophisticated face, turn suddenly cold and contemptuous, to know that you had been tried for the inner ring and rejected. And then, if you are drawn in, next week it will be something a little further from the rules, and next year something further still. But all in the jolliest, friendliest spirit. It may end in a crash, a scandal, and penal servitude. It may end in millions, a peerage, and giving the prizes at your old school. But you will be a scoundrel. This is a perfect description of what we call now, right, the us and them mentality, right? And never mind whether the us is somebody that you think is doing good work or doing bad work. The power of the inner ring is the power to make people do good or evil, right? You can essentially entice somebody into anything if you entice them along the lines of, well, other people don't really get it. They're not really part of this. And so what I find useful about this as a moral instruction is that it doesn't actually depend on your, having the right ideas or being in the right philosophical set. A lot of times, obviously we're in a lot of big political fights in this country, and I participate in those. I don't think they're unimportant, but we forget that even in the right groups of people, quote unquote, even in, on the conservative side, let's say, if you're like me and you're a conservative, you can still become enticed into this. You can still be enticed into fudging the facts because you feel like you just need to get a point in, and, you'll be applauded and you're set. Twitter almost creates this, right? It creates a circumstance in which we're all hyper aware of our own inner ring and kind of performing for them. And so Lewis is basically founding his drama on this, and he shows how Mark begins with just that desire to be on the inside and eventually becomes the agent of Satan, or rather the agent of Satan's working in the world, because there is this organization called the NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. But of course, the acronym is NICE. They're nice. These are nice people. And this is why I compared them to Davos at the beginning, because there is a certain rhetoric of rationality, right? Of, we're the sensible people, and we're the ones looking at the data and thinking about the facts and coordinating all the experiments in one place. And we're realizing that, in the future, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Right? Just leave it to us. Fauci, I represent the science, right? I am the one who comes to you from a place of superior knowledge and wisdom and understanding. And I'm here to help you. I'm here to make things safe. I'm here to make things better. And of course, it turns out that they're here effectively to rule the world, to take over the world. And so the Klaus Schwabs and the Anthony Faucis of the world are effectively manifested in the NICE, the NICE. They're called the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments because their ostensible goal is to consolidate the scientific work that's going on around the country into one massive scientific conglomerate. Now, we're going to get to the science of it all, right? The NICE, you might say, represents the science, right? And not the science in terms of actual experiment and data verification, since nobody represents that. Anybody can do that. But they represent the authority to proclaim on what science should be done, what goals should be adopted, right? Moral goals. And I've talked about this before, that science as a practice has effectively expanded out to include in our rhetoric all sorts of things that should be the object of other kinds of philosophy, like political decisions, right? Why is Joe Biden out there joking that Anthony Fauci is the real president? Because this idea of science, not actual natural science, but this notion of science as the descriptor of all truth in the world, makes us think that political decisions about right and wrong, decisions about the direction of the country, should all be handed over to the experts, to the people who can calculate exactly the right outcome. But of course, calculating the right outcome depends on having certain moral convictions. And so this is what the NICE exists to do, to smuggle in a moral vision of the world. And what's brilliant is that Mark gets drawn into that without buying into any of it, just as part of his desire to go, into more and more exclusive circles. So I'll read to you now the moment when he basically makes that choice that Lewis is describing in the inner ring and becomes one of the scoundrels. So he's meeting here with Mr. Wither, who's a phenomenal, just spine-tingling, ghostly character. And he, like Curry, is the second in command. So we know he's part of the inner ring because he has this kind of he's the deputy director. He has this deputy role, and yet he's the person you talk to. And Mark has now become so enamored of this inner ring that he scorns and despises those guys on the outside, like Curry and at Bracton. They don't really know anything. And Lord Feverstone kind of ushers him into this new inner ring, which is the real inner ring, of course. So he's trying to talk to Mr. Wither to find out what they want him to do. NICE has sort of invited him in. They say they've got a job for him, but they won't tell him what it is. So he says, "Well," said Mr. Wither in a low voice, so rich that it was almost a sigh, "I am very glad you have raised this issue now in a quite informal way. Obviously, neither you nor I would wish to commit ourselves in this room in any sense which was at all injurious to the powers of the committee. He's always talking about the head and the committee that is above him. I quite understand your motives and respect them. We are not, of course, speaking of an appointment, capital A, in the quasi-technical sense of the term. It would be improper for both of us, though you may well remind me in different ways, to do so. Or at least it might lead to certain inconveniences. But I think I can most definitely assure you that nobody wants to force you in any kind of straight waistcoat or bed of Procrustes. We do not really think among ourselves in terms of strictly demarcated functions, of course. I take it that men like you and me are, well, to put it frankly, hardly in the habit of using concepts of that type. Everyone in the Institute feels that his own work is not so much a departmental contribution to an end already defined as a moment or grade in the progressive self-definition of an organic whole. And Mark said, God forgive him, for he was young and shy and vain and timid, all in one. I do think that is so important. The elasticity of your organization is one of the things that attracts me. After that, he had no further chance of bringing the director to the point, and whenever the slow, gentle voice ceased, he found himself answering in its own style, and apparently helpless to do otherwise, despite the torturing recurrence of the question, what are we both talking about? At the very end of the interview, there came one moment of clarity. Mr. Wither supposed that he, Mark, would find it convenient to join the nice club. Even for the next few days, he would be freer as a member than as someone's guest. Mark agreed, and then flushed crimson like a small boy on learning that the easiest course was to become a life member at the cost of £200. He had not that amount in the bank. Of course, if he had got the new job, with its $1,500 a year, all would be well. But had he got it? Was there a job at all? How silly, he said aloud. I haven't got my checkbook with me. A moment later, he found himself on the stairs with Feverstone. Well, asked Mark eagerly. Feverstone did not seem to hear him. Well, repeated Mark, when shall I know my fate? I mean, have I got the job? Hello, Guy, bawled Feverstone suddenly to a man in the hall beneath. Next moment he had trotted down to the foot of the stairs, grasped his friend warmly by the hand, and disappeared. Mark, following him more slowly, found himself in the hall, silent, alone, and self-conscious, among the groups and pairs of chattering men who were all crossing it towards the big folding doors on his left. Like I say, the genius of this novel is that even though all of the cosmic drama is going on, and we're going to get to that in a bit, even though eventually Ransom reappears and space and the Oyarsa and all of that, the real scenes take place in these incredibly minutely observed social interactions. And again, Wither is a brilliant character. He's there to obfuscate what's going on. He's there to talk in a million different kind of, either professional jargon or just vagaries and nonsense, right? Until you sort of feel cowed that you don't know what he's talking about. And this incredible confidence that he projects, right? He's talking nonsense and you feel like, oh, yes, of course. This is like at a job interview, right? Job you really want. Somebody asks, why do you want to work here? And you don't say what you're really thinking. You don't say, well, I want the salary, or I want, I need a job, or you say whatever you think the person wants to hear. and so this whole thing functions, this whole organization functions by keeping everyone in the position of being in a job interview. This is what we eventually find out, is that even the people on the inner ring are trying to perform for people above them, which is, of course, what you always find out when you get into the inner ring. And Lewis makes a wonderful comment at one point that finally, Mark realizes the people who told him that this organization was such an important thing to be a part of are people whom he now despises because he considers them part of the old ring. And so this endless hunger for inclusion in human society, right, reveals itself for what it is, which is just an empty sort of self-feeding hunger, a kind of Ouroboros, or a snake that eats its own tail, right? And that's, when you get down to the logic of satanic evil, it's always that. It's not necessarily, hideous and ugly, though of course it can be. It doesn't necessarily involve physical violence, although Satan can induce terrible physical violence. The essential nature of Satan is to get you away from God, who is a final ultimate goal, and toward a desire that feeds itself, that replicates itself, that the more you consume, the more you need and want. And that's what the lust for the inner ring is. Lewis compares it to lust and says, in fact, even, the lust that we talk about of sexual desire is really just one instance, and perhaps not even a very impressive instance, of this overcoming just hunger for belonging, for inclusion, for love from people who withhold it, people who withhold love from us. So that's the sort of interpersonal mechanism of this part of the story. As that's going on, there unfolds before us a vision of what the nice is actually about, what they are actually doing. And the first part of that vision comes in the section that I read at the very beginning. I'm now going to read more of it. It's an interaction between Mark and this woman called the Fairy, another great character, sort of thinly veiled lesbian sadomasochist policewoman. And she has this team of kind of giggly girl enforcers underneath her. And she herself is this sadistic, mannish woman with obvious desires to rule the world. And she's talking about, among other things, getting Mark to incite riots and then get the nice to sail in and take things over. So the plan of the nice, and this will also sound very familiar to you, is to internecine resentments in the local area of Edgestow. They want a fight between the nice workers who have come in to basically revamp everything, and the locals of the town, who are not just the gownies, but the townies, right? Not just the people at the university, but mostly the rural farmers and workers who are out there. They want a fight, an economic fight between them and riots between them, so that then they can convince the government that this is an emergency. We need powers to step in. If this does not sound to you like the summer of 2020, I don't know what to tell you. In any case, here's how she describes her goal. "There are only two papers we don't control," said the Fairy, "and we'll smash them. You've got to get the ordinary man into the state in which he says sadism automatically when he hears the word punishment, and then one would have carte blanche." Mark did not immediately follow this, but the Fairy pointed out that what had hampered every English police force up to date was precisely the idea of deserved punishment, for desert was always finite. You could do so much to the criminal and no more. Remedial treatment, on the other hand, need have no fixed limit. It could go on till it had effected a cure, and those who were carrying it out would decide when that was. And if cure were humane and desirable, how much more prevention? Soon, anyone who had ever been in the hands of the police at all would come under the control of the NICE. In the end, every citizen. "And that's where you and I come in, Sonny," added the Fairy, tapping Mark's chest with her forefinger. "There's no distinction in the long run between police work and sociology. You and I have got to work hand in hand." This had brought Mark back to his doubts as to whether he were really being given a job, and, if so, what it was. The Fairy had warned him that Steele was a dangerous man. "There are two people you want to be very cautious about," she said. "One is Frost, and the other is old Wither." But she had laughed at his fears in general. "You're in all right, Sonny," she said, "only don't be too particular about what exactly you've got to do. You'll find out as it comes along. Wither doesn't like people who try to pin him down. There's no good saying you've come here to do this and you won't do that. The game's too fast just at present for that sort of thing. You're going to make yourself useful, and don't believe everything you're told." There is no better way to cherish your favorite memories than with Paint Your Life. This service makes a great gift, but it's also a wonderful way if you're just decorating a room of your house or thinking about how to encapsulate some of the most special memories in your life. If you take any picture and send it off to Paint Your Life, they will assign you a real-life artist who will paint by hand a beautiful reproduction of this picture. You can see the one that I got behind me. I really love it. It's a lovely little portrait of my cat when he was a kitten, Chad Cat as a little baby, and I will totally cherish it. I keep it up in my studio and sort of look back at it and chuckle all the time. This is a great gift, as I said, that you can give to friends or family, but it's also a wonderful thing to do for yourself if you're decorating your home. You can get your portrait in as little as 2 weeks, and it's very low risk because if you don't like it, you can get your money back. So text Heretics to 64,000 at paintyourlife.com. There's no risk. If you don't love the final painting, your money is refunded, guaranteed. And right now, as a limited time offer, you can get 20% off your painting. That's 20% off and free shipping. To get this special offer, text the word Heretics, Heretics, to 64,000. That's Heretics to 64,000. So text the word Heretics to the number 64,000. Paint Your Life. Celebrate the moments that matter most. Terms apply. They are available at paintyourlife.com/terms. So this is going to be, in fact, the next choice, the small choice that Mark makes that will turn him into a scoundrel, is that he's a good writer. And they're going to use that and he's going to become a writer for the high and the low press. The fairy says there's only a couple papers we don't own, and we'll smash them. And so he's going to write now for, the Washington Post and the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, and at every level, popular press and higher press, right? So this whole kind of press conglomerate is all going to be expressing the same opinion from different angles. And the papers that we don't control, like the Daily Wire, for example, or these smaller conglomerates, locals, right? These will be crushed. We will crush them because we don't own them. A classic example, right? These Twitter accounts are spreading misinformation. We need to kick the New York Post off of Twitter because they broke a story that the conglomerate doesn't like, right? This is how they do their work. And the whole thing is enabling them to establish this idea of corrective or ameliorative punishment. Lewis described this more deeply. In 1954, he wrote The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment. And this was his sort of assessment of calls to abolish the death penalty, another live debate, which he was stepping into. And he says, the doctrine, I'm quoting here, the doctrine, merciful though it appears, really means that each one of us, from the moment he breaks the law, is deprived of the rights of a human being. The reason is this: the humanitarian theory removes from punishment the concept of desert, but the concept of desert is the only connecting link between punishment and justice. It is only as deserved or undeserved that a sentence can be just or unjust. I do not here contend that the question, is it deserved, is the only one we can reasonably ask about a punishment. We may very properly ask whether it is likely to deter others and reform the criminal. But neither of these two last questions is a question about justice. There is no sense in talking about a just deterrent or a just cure. We demand of a deterrent not whether it is just, but whether it will deter. We demand of a cure not whether it is just, but whether it succeeds. Thus, when we cease to consider what the criminal deserves and consider only what will cure him or deter others, we have tacitly removed from the sphere of justice altogether. Instead of a person, a subject of rights, we now have a mere object, a patient, a case. This is genius, and it speaks very deeply to everything we've been talking about as we talk about the Republic, Plato's Republic, right? This idea which we're developing and which we're actually going to get more into in the next episode when we do Republic Book 4, that justice is suum cuique, to each what he deserves, or to each his own, meaning that everybody has not only the role in society that they are fitted for, but the things that they have worked for and the punishments that they have deserved. And Lewis says if you take that idea away, then punishment is just an instrument of power, of getting the public to look the way that you want. Deterrence, cures, all of these things may be worthwhile in some cases. We may wish to deter people from committing murder, but let's imagine that we could deter people from committing murder by ritually sacrificing an innocent person in the public square, right? We wouldn't do that. Why? Because it wouldn't be just, because the person who was innocent would not deserve the punishment. And so this idea of desert for Lewis is effectively what we pull away when we get this idea that actually all of our public policies are not about justice. They're not about doing what's right and wrong. They're about curing what we perceive to be the ills of the people, the deplorables, the common man, all those nasty unwashed masses. And this is also incidentally why Plato doesn't want doctors to rule his polis, his city-state, because doctors don't have in mind justice or the good. They have in mind only a very narrow good, which is the good of the health of the body. And if everything is subordinated to that aim, then you'll have a meaningless and empty life, much like the one you would live if you obeyed every lockdown order in the world that was ever issued. So that's the sort of sociological outward-facing side of the Institute. Now let's talk about the inner ring of the nice, where the scientists are developing their plan, which is actually directly related to this idea of sanitization and cure. It's taking that idea all the way out to its end point, its last conclusion. Here's another great character, Filostrato, the Italian scientist, and Filostrato he sort of thinks of himself as the real brains behind the operation. He's a genius experimenter. He's a master of the empirical sciences, and he's a great example of what happens when masters of the empirical sciences consider themselves moral masters of the universe. This is one of the many times in which Mark is kind of on the outs from the inner ring, and Philostrato kind of takes him under his wing and explains to him what's really going on here. He says, Philostrato turned sharply from him, and with a great scarping movement, flung back the window curtains. Then he switched off the light. The fog had all gone. The wind had risen. Small clouds were scudding across the stars, and the full moon, Mark had never seen her so bright, stared down upon them. As the clouds passed her, she looked like a ball that was rolling through them. Her bloodless light filled the room. "There is a world for you, no?" said Philostrato. "There is cleanness, purity. Thousands of square miles of polished black rock with not one blade of grass, not one fiber of lichen, not one grain of dust, not even air. Have you thought what it would be like, my friend, if you could walk on that land? No crumbling, no erosion. The peaks of those mountains are real peaks, sharp as needles. They would go through your hand. Cliffs as high as Everest and as straight as the wall of a house. And cast by those cliffs, acres of shadow black as ebony, and in the shadow hundreds of degrees of frost. And then, one step beyond the shadow, light that would pierce your eyeballs like steel and rock that would burn your feet. The temperature is at the boiling point. You would die, no? But even then, you would not become filth. In a few moments, you are a little heap of ash, clean, white powder. And mark, no wind to blow that powder about. Every grain in the little heap would remain in its place, just where you died, till the end of the world. But that is nonsense. The universe will have no end." "Yes, a dead world," said Mark, gazing at the moon. "No," said Philostrato. He had come close to Mark and spoke almost in a whisper, the bat-like whisper of a voice that is naturally high-pitched. "No, there is life there." "Do we know that?" asked Mark. "Oh, si, intelligent life, under the surface, a great race, further advanced than we, an inspiration, a pure race. They have cleaned their world, broken free almost from the organic. But how? They do not need to be born and breed and die. Only their common people, their canaglia, do that. The masters live on. They retain their intelligence. They can keep it artificially alive after the organic body has been dispensed with. A miracle of applied biochemistry. They do not need organic food. You understand? They are almost free of nature, attached to her only by the thinnest, finest cord." "Do you mean that all that," Mark pointed to the mottled globe of the moon, "is their own doing? Why not? If you remove all the vegetation, presently you have no atmosphere, no water. But what was the purpose? Hygiene. Why should they have their world all crawling with organisms? And specially they would banish one organism. Her surface is not all as you see. There are still surface dwellers, savages, one great dirty patch on the far side of her where there is still water and air and forests, yes, and germs and death. They are slowly spreading their hygiene over the whole globe, disinfecting her. The savages fight against them. There are frontiers and fierce wars in the caves and galleries down below. But the great race presses on. If you could see the other side, you would see year by year the clean rock, like this side of the moon, encroaching, the organic stain, all the green and blue and mist, growing smaller, like cleaning tarnished silver. And so now, finally, the mythology of Lewis's sci-fi world starts to enter into this maniacal world of the nice. And we see exactly how it works, because remember, you will recall from our discussion of the first book that there's a kind of barrier around the earth, and that the bent one, the fallen Oyarsa, that is Satan, rules this earth, but he's been circumscribed within the earth so that he can't affect places like Paralandra and Malcandra, can't affect Mars and Venus and all the other now or rational animals that are living on there. And the moon is basically bisected by this line, and every time it turns around, the people sort of these satanic beings sort of cleanse it for the sake of hygiene, cleanse it of all life, all the natural organic things, and of course of procreation, right? And sex is actually very important in this novel because natural procreation between a man and woman, the healthy desire for that to happen, is a kind of symbol, as it is in real life, a nexus of actual organic fleshly desire and the love toward which it can be directed. And this is another thing that we are currently trying to scrub out of the world in the name of efficiency, right? All of our talk about, if you've seen that people are trying to develop exterior wombs so that women don't have to be impeded when they want to go to work by giving birth to babies, the easier and more sort of direct approach to this problem is simply to kill the baby in the womb, right? This is the very logic of abortion, is that there is a kind of spontaneity and uncontrollable reality about another life growing inside you that causes inconveniences. And even if you took those inconveniences upon yourself by having unprotected consensual sex, there is a certain lobby that wants you to be able to just sort of go back on that if your plans take other shapes, right? This total capacity of the adult rational mind to control everything around it, right, is the extreme of this post-human ideal, that we're going to abstract ourselves just into mind. We're going to leave the animal behind entirely. And it turns out, of course, that this is the whisper that Satan has been placing in the ears of our so-called wise men in the 20th and now in the 21st century. So now I am again trying to tiptoe around the plot so that I don't give away exactly how it all works. But I am going to read to you from the Abolition of Man, which I think is where Lewis has developed the idea he's talking about most precisely, and where we can see directly its relevance, why it is that the same organization that would want to rule the entire world with a police force, right, to defund, quote unquote, the police and then exert its own power over right and wrong, right, why that same organization would also end up wanting to cleanse the world of humanity and human nature. Abolition of Man, 1943, Lewis writes, "It is, of course, a commonplace to complain that men have hitherto used badly and against their fellows the powers that science has given them. But that is not the point I am trying to make. I am not speaking of particular corruptions and abuses which an increase of moral virtue would cure. I am considering what the thing called man's power over nature must always and essentially be. No doubt the picture could be modified by public ownership of raw materials and factories and public control of scientific research. But unless we have a world state, this will still mean the power of one nation over others. And even within the world state or the nation, it will mean, in principle, the power of majorities over minorities, and, in the concrete, of a government over the people. And all long-term exercises of power, especially in breeding, must mean the power of earlier generations over later ones. The latter point is not always sufficiently emphasized, because those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by always including time among the dimensions. In order to understand fully what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, we must picture the race extended in time, from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Each generation exercises power over its successors, and each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors. This modifies the picture which is sometimes painted of a progressive emancipation from tradition and a progressive control of natural processes, resulting in a continual increase of human power. In reality, of course, if any one age really attains, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And if, as is almost certain, the age which had thus attained maximum power over posterity were also the age most emancipated from tradition, it would be engaged in reducing the power of its predecessors almost as drastically as that of its successors. And we must also remember that, quite apart from this, the later a generation comes, the nearer it lives to that date at which the species becomes extinct, the less power it will have in the forward direction, because its subjects will be so few. There is therefore no question of a power vested in the race as a whole steadily growing as long as the race survives. The last men, far from being the heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon the future. We all know that we're born into history. We've talked about this at enormous length on this podcast and, of course, elsewhere. We know that we are affected by the choices that our ancestors make, not only in physical terms, if our mother smokes while we're in the womb, or if we, are raised in certain ways with certain, nutritious food, whatever, we might grow up taller, or all these sort of biological facts, but also according to the traditions that went before us and the history that has led us up to the point where, for example, today, you can choose which church to join. Right? If you live in Europe, you can choose to join a church or no church or different churches or alternative churches, right? Why is that? Because so many generations before you, there was this thing called the Reformation and this thing called the 30 Years' War, right? And all of this history, which has created the world in which you live. And so Lewis is effectively saying there's no getting around exerting power over the future. And if you exert your power over the future to reduce their scope of choices, to create, to lock them in to your vision of the pure and clean world, then you will effectively have made yourself a tyrant over a race of slaves to come. If you want to take your education forward, there's no better place to do it than the Albertus Magnus Institute. These guys are phenomenal, and they are providing an antidote to all the problems with our education system that we talk about on this show. There's no doubt that our higher education system is broken. It's been captured either by woke political interests or by sort of dry bureaucracy, sometimes by both. The Albertus Magnus Institute fixes that by offering a free fellowship, the Magnus Fellowship, of live online interactive courses. It's free to join, like I said, and you can join today at magnusinstitute.org/heretics. All sorts of live online interactive classes in the good stuff. Albertus Magnus is famous for his treatise On the Highest Good, and they carry on that tradition at the Albertus Magnus Institute with this Magnus Fellowship. Discover why the Magnus Fellowship is the fastest growing liberal arts learning community in the world. I recommend it to anyone who is in search of an educational opportunity that is more substantive and more human than what you're going to get in your average state-funded university. You can join the free fellowship at magnusinstitute.org/heretics. And when you use that link, you'll also get a free gift. So check it out, magnusinstitute.org/heretics. One last time, I'm going to say that I'm trying here not to spoil the plot. There is so much more to this novel, but what I've tried to do is leave out the conclusion, which is there's throughout this whole novel, there's a second story, a second plot going on, a kind of thread that will eventually generate the end of the book, what happens at the end. And the climax of this, the confrontation between the nice and the powers of heaven, that is the various Oyarsas and angelic rulers who have been conscripted by God to come down and fight back, right? The final confrontation, the climax confrontation, is so good you have to read it yourself. But I am going to say that effectively what is happening to Jane while Mark is off being seduced by the nice is that she is realizing she's a kind of medium. She has a lineage in the Tudor line, so the old line of kings, and it turns out that her lineage stretches back and back and back to the time of King Arthur, which we've talked about at some length before. If you go back and listen to the Roland episodes and the Gawain episodes, I talked about the myth, the legend of Arthur, and its crucial importance both for pre and post Roman Britain. So Lewis here thinks of Arthur and the historical King Arthur as a kind of link between the noble pagan past and the modern and the Christian world, right? Merlin and Arthur are therefore these kind of hinge figures where all of the magic that was in the world, that was sort of just there for people to use and abuse and use for good, was then constrained by the revelation of Christ, which then taught us the meaning of, all of our fairy tales and all of our stories. And once Christ comes, once the nation is made Christian, then the constraints start to fall down, because now we know certain truths and we can't just willy-nilly invoke different sprites and magic powers. But before this, there was kind of more of a hurly-burly of elves and sprites and fairies all rollicking about. And of course, this speaks also to the fact that this whole trilogy takes place within the world of the Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings takes place in this kind of pre-Christian universe in which magic is still kind of abundantly there for the taking. And so it turns out that both Jane, and she eventually gets linked up with Ransom, who's returned from Paralandra, and their whole crew is trying to get to this ancient power from the days of Camelot and the days of King Arthur before the Nice gets to it, because the Nice also knows about it, and their project, it actually turns out, is the same as the Merlin project. They want to unite their scientific power to the magical power of the ancient past. And Lewis had written about this as well. He was a scholar, among other things, of the medieval world, and he wrote in Abolition of Man about the relationship between magic and science. He says, I have described as a magician's bargain that process whereby man surrenders object after object and finally himself to nature in return for power. And I meant what I said. The fact that the scientist has succeeded where the magician failed has put such a wide contrast between them in popular thought that the real story of the birth of science is misunderstood. You will even find people who write about the 16th century as if magic were a medieval survival and science the new thing that came in to sweep it away. Those who have studied the period know better. There was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The 16th and 17th centuries are the high noon of magic. The serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died, the other strong and throve, but they were twins. They were born of the same impulse. I allow that some, certainly not all, of the early scientists were actuated by a pure love of knowledge, but if we consider the temper of that age as a whole, we can discern the impulse of which I speak. He's saying that the real desire behind both science and magic is to exert human control over the natural world. And magic tries to do it through incantations, which don't work. Science does it through empirical study, which does work. But the desire is the same. And so now in this drama, he basically dramatizes the coming together of these two kinds of power, because in the magical stories, of course, magic actually does work. And so I'm going to read one last passage here and then tell you to go find out what happens for yourself. Mr. and Mrs. Dimble, who are another, I mean, every character in this is like so phenomenal. Mr. Dimble is a sort of scholar, an obscure scholar of Arthurian legend. And he's basically figured out that Merlin and Arthur are real. And he says Merlin is the reverse of Belbury, where the nice is. He's at the opposite extreme. He's the last vestige of an old order in which matter and spirit were, from our modern point of view, confused. For him, every operation on nature is a kind of personal contact, like coaxing a child or stroking one's horse. After him came the modern man, to whom nature is something dead, a machine to be worked and taken to bits if it won't work the way that he pleases. Finally come the Belbury people, who take over that view from the modern man unaltered and simply want to increase their power by tacking onto it the aid of spirits. Extranatural, anti-natural spirits. Of course, they hoped to have it both ways. They thought the old magia of Merlin, which worked in the spiritual qualities of nature, loving and reverencing them and knowing them from within, could be combined with the new goetia, the brutal surgery from without. No, in a sense, Merlin represents what we've got to get back to in some different way. Do you know that he is forbidden by the rules of his order to use any edged tool on any growing thing? Good gracious, said Miss Dimble, there's 6 o'clock. So this is the end of the dialogue. We don't get to learn more, at least in that conversation, about how all of this works. But that distinction that Lewis makes between magia and goetia, these two different kinds of words for magic, goetia being sort of sorcery, malevolent sorcery, and magia being kind of tapping into the forces of the powers of nature, he's saying we have to get back to some union between those two things, which is what we have to do as well. And why I have been stressing this whole trilogy for 3 weeks now is because the crisis of science worship in our time is a crisis of the unsustainability of materialism. You can't look at the world as if it's just a dead thing with atoms bouncing off of one another. You can look at it that way for a time in order to figure out how to do certain things and accomplish certain goals, but those goals themselves have to live in a metaphysical world, that is a world of good and evil, right and wrong. And science has effectively started telling these stories of good and evil and right and wrong because it's laid claim to telling us everything about ourselves, who we are, why we exist, what our purpose is, what we are in the universe. And so we don't just say like, oh, man evolved out of monkeys. We also have this weird sort of drama about how, and that, this is part of this grand, glorious evolution, this advance into this beautiful future. There's no beautiful future or noble ideals in evolution. The same thing is true actually of the multiverse, right? Which is effectively an answer to the question, how can it be, first of all, that macroscopic and microscopic forces don't work in seemingly the same way, but also how can it be that our world is so perfectly calibrated to sustain life? All of these constants which exist in this minute range where only these constants could possibly exist, like the force of gravity, the strong force, all of these forces are minutely calibrated so that our world sustains life. And the multiverse is a way of saying how that could be without God, right? That this could simply be the one universe among infinitely many where these things, where it happens to be the case that life exists. Perhaps that's a theory, but it's completely untestable. And in fact, there are currently scientists arguing that we should relax the standards of empirical testing in order to believe in the multiverse as science. It's not science. It's a story. It's a story about what the world is and where it comes from. And it's not a very good one because it makes the world effectively chaotic and meaningless. So as long as scientists are out here, right, inventing grand narratives about who we are and where we come from, let me propose one of my own. In the beginning, God created the world. And that is why the world is not only functional in an ordered way, but also contains within it expressions of higher truths. And so even as we discover more and more how to use the world, how to take care of it, what the rules of it are that God has ordained at our level of interacting with it, right? It seems as if they don't totally hold good in these extreme cases, but Newtonian physics and then Einsteinian relativity, right? These things that we can use to understand the world. Even as we understand that, we have to be holding in our mind the question, what does this mean? What are we? And how can we retain our humanity and seek virtue and the truth in the context of this world of wonders that science is opening up to us? This is the blend of magic and science that Lewis is talking about. And it is our task not to jettison science just because clowns like Dr. Fauci are misusing it and abusing it, using it as a cudgel, not to be afraid of technology just because, sociopaths like Zuckerberg are trying to upload us all into some kind of weird abstracted cloud or alternate reality or matrix, but to reject all of that and say these tools exist in the context of a world that is imbued with meaning and was created by a mind. And so our use of them should be dictated by that. And it's not inevitable that we would use them in the other way that the Davos people want us to use them, to cleanse the world of all human life. Nobody wrote that in the stars. They're just acting like it because technology does indeed march forward. And so now they're pretending that the march forward of technology is their march forward. But nobody said that. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to us. It is a power that man exerts, and he exerts it for purposes, and those purposes are to be dictated by the old virtues, the high, the good, the true, and the beautiful, and above all, the preservation of the human soul in service of God who created the world, science, and all. Happy Christmas. Go read these books. They're so good. It is very important to me that all of my listeners become fabulously wealthy gajillionaires, and that is why I am very excited to be partnering with Truebill. I'm so glad these guys are sponsoring the show because they have saved me a ton of money, and we must get about building our vast Young Heretics empire and taking over the world. In order to do that, we need to be fabulously rich, and so we cannot be spending a ton of money on subscriptions that we don't use. Subscription services are really good at ensnaring you in useless expenditures of money. They either sign you up for a free trial or you just stop using their service, but you forget to cancel. And before you know it, you're just bleeding funds into whatever, Netflix or Disney Plus. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. It's like a little financial manager in your pocket that just looks through all your subscriptions, cancels the ones you don't need or want. Go right now, truebill.com/heretics. It could save you thousands a year that you're spending on stuff you don't use. There are reports from people who have saved, $800+ on just car insurance alone. You could be saving that much and more when you go to truebill.com/heretics so that you can accrue your massive wealth and build the Young Heretics empire with me. Mailbag questions come to me through Locals, and just like our merchandise offer, our Locals offer has been extended through January 15th. You don't need a code or anything. Just go to youngheretics.com/shop, and for $40, you can become a VIP for the whole year. It's usually $56, and you get a lot for that. You get episodes a week in advance. You get to ask questions and be in the mailbag. You get exclusive essays. I'm currently, or I have been at this Advent season, writing a Young Heretics Advent calendar. There will be more stuff like that you can only get if you are a VIP. It's a phenomenal community where we talk about how to proceed in our lives, applying the principles that we discuss on this show and working out the ideas that we talk about from the great works of the West in our personal lives. youngheretics.com/locals. It's only $40 until January 15th, and then the price will go back up. So go check it out. Okay, here's a mailbag question from Tyler. I'm reading Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, and he starts off with an interesting premise. He seems to be saying, admittedly some of it is over my head, that the purpose of the canon is a sort of aesthetic progression that gives us a backdrop to see human nature played out and interact with it. He rejects the right's desire to pull ethics from it and the school of resentment's desire to pull political considerations from it. My personal feeling is that he overstates his case. I don't think we center Shakespeare and Homer only because of their aesthetics. Aren't there ethical and political insights that also attract us and merit honoring these works? How should we be interacting with the canon on an aesthetic, ethical, and political level? To what extent should they guide us? All right, so this is a question that speaks directly to what I was just talking about on Locals, right? We're spending all this time reading this stuff, in part because we think it will enrich our lives, but in part because we think it'll give us ideas that we might go away and actually act on in the real world. Fancy that. So I'm going to leave Bloom aside for another time because we should talk about him directly. But you are posing a question that you've drawn from Bloom, which is really valid, right? That Bloom basically faults the right for trying to get like moral lessons out of literature, and he faults the left or the school of resentment for trying to impose this kind of identity-based vision on what books are worthwhile and which books teach us, the good and the true virtue of equity and gender parity or whatever. And in that sense, I think he's onto something, and I think he's right. Camille Paglia makes a similar argument in Glittering Images, which is her book about visual art. But I think that you're right that this is only part of the equation. The right does get this wrong, does get art wrong a little bit, but not because they want art to have an ethical component. Everybody in the culture war actually recognizes implicitly that art has power over our ethical lives, that it shapes our souls, that it guides the way we look at the world. It even shapes the kinds of things that we want and how we go about trying to get them. All of this it does by making things beautiful or ugly, right? By putting before us visions of the world that make us desire certain things, love certain things, and hate other things. And it has tremendous emotional power over us. And because it has tremendous emotional power, it has ethical shaping power over us. Where the right, I think, goes wrong is not in wanting there to be a moral sensibility in how we consume art, but in wanting the kind of morality that art has to be a morality that only shows the good stuff, right? When we demand that movies like not have swear words in them or not have promiscuous sex in them or whatever, we're effectively demanding that our art only portray the kind of life that we want the good guys to live. And the ethics of art actually don't work that way. Art doesn't just teach you ethically by showing you what the right course of action is. Art exists and teaches you by showing you the whole panoply of human life, including its moral dimension. So the left's problem, I think, is this argument that you can just remove the traditional moral dimension and then insert this other moral dimension, right? You can basically take away any constraint on sexuality. You can have people twerking and singing WAP and whatever in front of like little children. Sexual ethics don't matter, but identity ethics matter a lot, right? They're trying to show you a vision of the world where like women are strong and women have guns and, like every formerly white male hero is replaced by a like genius black woman, right? Look at Apple's foundation. You'll see that I'm not really exaggerating here, right? That's an ethical vision of the world. They're trying more sophisticatedly than the right. They're trying to instill their ethical vision on the world by displaying it to the world all the time, right? WAP, foundation, all of these things are all part of this grand vision of what is good and bad. The right is trying to respond by just cutting things out, by saying, don't show this, don't show this, don't show this. What we need to do is say, the problem with the left's moral vision in art is not that it's moral, it's that it's wrong, right? It's that they have a false view of the world, that sexual promiscuity is fun and consequence-free, that women are the same as men and should want the same things as men. It's not that they're showing sex, it's that they're lying about it, right? And so we should want true art that shows the true facts of the world without denying any of it. Not the fact that there's murder, nor the fact that murder is wrong. Not the fact that there's promiscuous sex, nor the fact that it ruins lives and it causes shame, right? A great example of this that I use all the time is Macbeth, right? If Macbeth were made today, I guarantee you would have like some portions of the right saying, it's too violent, don't show the blood, right? If Shakespeare had written it yesterday. It's old, so we don't say this. But why would that be wrong? It would be wrong because Macbeth is about how murder and violence in the service of ambition hollows your soul out from the inside until all you can see is emptiness. And that speech, that famous speech at the end, is about how the world looks to you after you have given up the moral universe, right? Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in his petty pace from day to day till the last syllable of recorded time and all our yesterdays, right? Everything is empty. It's all just an empty shadow, a poor player strutting on a stage, a tale of sound and fury told by an idiot. Macbeth is a genius work of art because although it is incredibly gory and incredibly violent and makes no bones about that, it also tells the truth about the moral universe. And that's what we're missing. We're missing art that tells the truth about the moral universe without hiding or concealing anything. The right wants to conceal stuff, the left wants to lie, and what we should be trying to do is show the full truth and nothing but the truth in art. And that includes the nasty bits, but it also includes the moral dimension of the nasty bits. Thanks for that question. I love talking about this particular sort of stuff, Tyler. I will see you on Locals. One more time, it's youngheretics.com/locals. Get it for $40 for the whole year. Become a VIP. You won't regret it. Love to see you there. All right. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute where I work. We are an institute for the recovery, defense, and propagation of the American idea. You can read our published work at the Claremont Review of Books and at AmericanMind.org. And you can also donate to help support our work at claremont.org/donate. If you do mention in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, that would make my heart sing. I will see you all next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.